God had chosen a people to be his own. God had chosen a king, David, to rule his people. And God had promised that a son of David would rule upon his throne forever. Now, if Israel heard that promise as meaning one of David's descendants would rule her from that time forward, father to son, from generation to generation, she quickly learned otherwise. Babylon defeated God's kingdom, took the king into captivity, destroyed his royal seat. And when in time God restored Israel to her land, he restored her as subject to a foreign king, first Cyrus, king of Persia, then the line of one of Alexander the Great's generals, the Seleucids, and then the Romans. And so it remains. No son of David has occupied his father's throne since the Babylonian captivity. And indeed, while there may be sons of David out there somewhere, none of them is known to us. Sometimes we think that God's promise is one thing, only to discover, sometimes the hard way, that it means something else. Israel came to see God promising not the continuity of a kingdom and a line of kings, but an intervention by God that would turn the course of history, an intervention by God that would establish a different sort of kingdom ruled by a different sort of king, a reign that would be righteous and just and eternal under a king who is both son of David and son of God. It was for the coming of such a king, the Messiah, the Anointed One, that John the Baptist had been sent to prepare the way. John knew who the Messiah was, St. Matthew tells us. For when his kinsman Jesus came to him to be baptized, he said, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" And even more, when Jesus came up from the water after his baptism, John saw the Spirit descend on him and heard the voice from heaven declare him God's beloved Son. Jesus began his ministry when John was arrested and imprisoned, going throughout Galilee and crying out, as John had cried out, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." Jesus taught the people in what we know as the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus cast out demons and healed. And it appears that what he heard Jesus was doing wasn't what John expected of the one for whom he had prepared the way to do. And so John, we read this morning, sent some of his disciples to Jesus to ask him, "Are you he who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And Jesus' response is simply to tell John's disciples to look and listen, and then go tell John what they've seen and heard. Jesus restores sight to the blind. Jesus makes the lame walk again. Jesus cleanses lepers. Jesus restores hearing to the deaf. Jesus raises the dead. In sum, Jesus says and does things which are good news to the poor. Now, these may not be the things people expected of the Messiah or even wanted of the Messiah. Ultimately, Jesus disappointed people's expectations, didn't he? That's why they turned against him. But the fact is that each of the things he has done fulfills the words of the prophets regarding the Messiah. Following his account of the Sermon on the Mount, in the 8th and 9th chapters of his gospel, St. Matthew recounts Jesus giving sight to the blind, making the lame walk, cleansing lepers, opening the ears of the deaf, raising the dead. And each of these is described by one or more of the ancient prophets as a mark, an evidence that Messiah has come, that God's intervention has begun. This morning we read from Isaiah, for instance, a prophecy that when the Lord comes to save his people, the eyes of the blind shall be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. Isaiah says what will happen when Messiah comes. Jesus tells John's disciples that what Isaiah had said would happen was happening before their very eyes. His answer to John's question is to send them back to John to tell him what they'd seen and heard. That may not be what John expected of Messiah. It may not be what John's disciples expected of Messiah. It may not be what God's people expected of Messiah. But it was what centuries before God had declared Messiah would do. Now, I want to be clear. The things people expected Messiah would do are likewise things which the prophets said he would do. And indeed, Jesus speaks of the fulfillment of these things, but speaks of that fulfillment as something that belongs to the future, to the end. But looking for what has not yet come to pass doesn't excuse a failure to recognize what has come to pass and what it means. Jesus has done what Isaiah prophesied the Son of David would do. And because he has done these things, the people ought to recognize him for who he is, recognize him as Messiah. Jesus will come again as judge. Jesus will come again as ruler. But Jesus has first come to us as restorer. He's come to us to make whole what has been distorted, to make us once again what he first made us to be when we were in paradise. He takes the physically wounded, the physically impaired, and makes them whole. He takes even the dead and makes them live. He undoes the consequences of our disobedience, of our fall. He undoes the hold the destructive power called sin has over us. And that's the foundation that Jesus lays at the beginning of the process that will go on until it is fulfilled on a day and at an hour no one, not even he, but only the Father knows. The judge we await has already come to restore us. The ruler we await has already come to make us whole. And that tells us the sort of judge, the sort of ruler he is and ever will be. One who seeks not to punish, not to dominate, not to destroy, but to restore, to save, to make us whole. One at whose coming everlasting joy shall be upon our heads. One at whose coming we shall obtain joy and gladness, and sorrow and sighing shall flee away.